by pointing at Sun's lawyer. Your client's an asshole. Pointing to me. Okay, so it's 4 o'clock. The March 6, 2023 Charlottesville City Council meeting will come to order. Ms. Thomas, will you please call the roll?
Councilor Payne?
Here.
Councilor Pinkston?
Here.
Councilor Puryear?
Here.
Mayor Snook?
Here.
Vice Mayor Wade?
Here.
Okay, all here, and we're pleased to be back up to full strength. And welcome to our new councilor, Leah Puryear. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
I know that Mr. Payne is delighted to not be by himself down there.
I know. Won't be so lonely on this.
Now he's got somebody to nudge with his elbow or something. Is there a motion to approve or to amend the agenda?
I move to approve the agenda.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion passes. So the meeting will be divided into 3 main sections as always. First is a work session to hear and discuss presentations that do not require a council vote, and tonight we'll be talking about transportation planning. There will then be a closed meeting, which we usually start around 5:30, and then there'll be a city council business meeting, which will begin around 6:30, with seating available here in the council chambers for up to 23 pre-registered attendees and media, and others are able to join electronically by Zoom. So at the 4 o'clock session here, it's not a public comment period. That starts at 6:30. Our report, our presentation, update on transportation planning. Ben Chambers, Transportation Planning Manager, to present. First of all, welcome. I don't know that you formally addressed us.
I have not yet. This would be my first time. We have several projects to talk about this evening, so we packaged them all into one thing. So we don't have to come back multiple times to talk about multiple projects. I believe there's a presentation that we're going to get put up on the
Do we have a presentation? There we go.
All right, so I'm giving an update on transportation planning. I don't think you've had one of these in quite a long time. So we can go ahead and go to the second slide. So hi, I'm Ben Chambers. I'm the Transportation Planning Manager for the city. I previously worked for the city about a decade ago. I was with the Pupil Transportation Division. Went back to grad school to get my planning degree and then worked in the private sector for a bit before I made my way back here. I'm excited to give you guys an update on what's going on in transportation planning. I think we'll start off with talking about what the city is trying to do with transportation first. So if we can go to the next slide. These are our goals for the city. Well, half of them. There's 4 more on the next slide. These come from our comprehensive plan. These deal with all sorts of different transportation issues. It's very comprehensive in nature, being in the comprehensive plan, but I'll go through each of our plan goals. First is complete streets. That's providing access and mobility for all users of all types, making sure that we have connections for bikes, pedestrians, transit throughout our city. Second is coordination of land use and community design. that is going to be what ties together development with transportation planning so that we aren't under-providing transportation options for new development. Number 3 is efficient mobility and access. This is mostly looking at making sure that our system is safe and efficient for our users. Number 4 is parking supply and management. That's both providing enough supply for parking and making sure we're not overbuilding parking to the detriment of other users and other potential land uses. Next slide. Our 5th goal is a transit system that is robust, that allows for reliable and efficient travel throughout Charlottesville. Number 6 is coordination with our regional partners to make sure that regional transportation is functioning efficiently. Number 7 is making sure that we're making sustainable investments in the infrastructure. And number 8 is finding where the money is so that we can make those investments. So when I came to the city, I wanted to evaluate whether we were going to have a hard time getting to these goals or not. So I looked at whether our transportation planning was good or not, for lack of a better word. So if you can go to the next slide. So the way I evaluated that was looking at something that we look at in planning called the 3 C's of comprehensive planning. And that's what we decided, what decides whether planning is being done well or not. So the 3 C's are it's being done comprehensively, it's being done continuously, and it's being done collaboratively. So on the comprehensive angle of things, it means both making sure we're taking care of everything that we need to take care of, and we're not leaving anything out. Right now, in the past, that has not been happening because a lot of the planning activities are happening in different silos and different departments throughout the city. So you have Public Works Engineering doing some work, you have NDS doing some work, you have CAT doing some work. They're all broken out in their own little silos and not necessarily communicating together and putting together a comprehensive planning strategy. Secondly, the second part of that comprehensive thing is it's not in one package. We have a transportation master plan that's identified in the comprehensive plan, but it makes up a half a dozen different plans. And they don't all agree with each other. The second point is continuous. So are we continuously updating our plans to make sure that they're relevant to what people need today and in the future? Our current plans are fairly old. We're basing a lot of our projects on the Bike Ped Master Plan and the Streets That Work Plan. The Bike Ped Master Plan was in 2015. The Streets That Work Plan was in 2016. Those haven't been updated since. And the data has aged. Trends have changed. People are moving differently than they did 5, 10 years ago, partly because of what happened with COVID. Also, in terms of continuity, the recommendations of these plans are conflicting. So there's no continuity across the plans. It would be fine if we had several different plans. They're all pointing to the same thing, but they're not. So we are lacking that continuity as well. And lastly, collaboration. See above, with the silos, it's making things more difficult to collaborate across departments. And then we're also having challenges with engaging the public effectively and doing public outreach. Some of that is just we've always had issues engaging with the public on transportation planning. Some of that is the results of COVID, and lots of cities and states and the federal government even is having issues with how do you deal with public engagement now that we've gone through that major pandemic change. So if you want to see how we're addressing these issues, we can take a look at the next slide, which gives you a taste of all of the different kinds of projects we're working on for transportation planning. So we have some regional projects like the Regional Transit Governance Study, moving toward 2050 Long-Range Transportation Plan. We have some programs that aren't really plans, but are things that we need to keep track of and understand the data on a continuous basis, and that we need to support in order to support transportation goals throughout the city. So things like handling the bike ped counters and things like the dockless permit program, safe routes to school. These are more programmatic, but they also lend towards transportation planning. And then we have some that are very mode specific. You see some CAT studies on there. You see some bus shelters, non-motorized infrastructure, bike ped kind of stuff. We have some specialized planning needs that we're taking care of with some of this work as well. We're not going to get into all of these tonight, and if you go to the next page, the next slide, we're only going to focus on these 4. We're going to look at the alternative fuels feasibility study that CAT is working on, the Safe Streets and Roads for All Action Plan grant that we won last month, the non-motorized infrastructure prioritization process, and the dockless permit regulations revisit. So we can get started with the first one, which would be the CAT Alternative Fuels Feasibility Study. If we can go to the next slide. So this study is looking at, is it feasible for CAT to switch from diesel to another fuel of some sort, preferably one that has 0 emissions? We need to go through this feasibility study in part so that down the line when we do make this switch, we have a plan in place that tells us how we're making this transition, which is actually a federal requirement so that they can give us funding to make that transition. So we are developing scenarios that look at what does it look like if we switch to CNG, what if we have battery electric buses, what if we have hydrogen fuel, what if we have battery electric buses and we have some en-route charging. These scenarios are looking at the workload of the vehicles under what was called the System Optimization Plan, which is what CAT aims to put into place once they have full staff. And so we're looking at, can the vehicles actually perform under that plan? Once we look at the feasibility of whether they can perform or not, we also want to look at the costs and benefits. And the benefits are largely greenhouse gas emissions reductions. We want to make sure that we're on the right target to meet targets from the Climate Action Plan. And we want to make sure that we know what the costs are associated with these before we go down one road or the other. So I'll go to the next slide and show you one sort of analysis that's being done is looking at challenges of range. So these are different work schedules, basically. And for a vehicle that says we have 225 miles of range on this battery, we would optimistically think you're probably going to get about 30% less than that, just due to weather, due to topography, due to number of people riding on the bus. You're probably going to hit about 30% reduction, and very, very worst case scenario, 40% reduction. If we put battery electric vehicles on our routes right now, some of the routes would not be able to finish the day with that vehicle, and we would have to bring a new vehicle out. So what does that mean in terms of our workforce? Do we have to have more extra boards that need to take vehicles out? Are we going to need to buy more vehicles? Are we going to need to get more maintenance staff to take care of those vehicles? Those are all considerations that we'll have to look at with each of these scenarios. So if you can go to the next slide, this sort of summarizes looking at these different work shifts. These are the different routes that we could potentially pilot a battery electric bus on based on that analysis. So you see some of the shorter routes, the 7S, 2A, 3E, 469. Those would be pretty decent candidates for a pilot project with electric vehicles. As you get to the longer routes, it's going to be more difficult for us to serve them with existing technology and with the existing blocks as they're set up for CAT.
Can I stop you a second?
Yes.
What does it mean to say not all operation blocks could be transitioned?
So the bar graph that I was just showing you, each of those is a block, and that is basically it's a piece of work that a vehicle or a driver does. So not all of those blocks are short enough to stay on one bus. So we wouldn't be able to just say it's a one-for-one diesel to electric vehicle transition for that block.
Okay.
You'd have to bring in a second vehicle for some of those longer blocks.
So by block, is that sort of just a technical term for how you all, or how Garland, I suppose, blocks his work in terms of the route and
Exactly.
the distance? And okay.
Exactly. So if we can go to the next slide, I'll tell you the next steps of this. We're wrapping up the scenario analysis in terms of how far a vehicle can go. Next, we're looking at calculating greenhouse gas emissions and costs associated. That would be both cost for the vehicle and cost for the capital facility needs, and any operations needs that would go along with that. We are moving towards a decision on technology this summer, or early this summer, late spring. We'll be doing stakeholder outreach for this in April. The feasibility study itself and any recommendations should be summed up in May, and then we'll be returning to you either at the end of May or beginning of June for your determination on which technology we should move forward with. That will be used to dictate a space redesign for the CAT facility so that we know, where we need to put more chargers, where we need to put more maintenance bays, where we're going to park vehicles. So after June, we'll start moving towards that and start talking about what the CAT facility will actually need to look like to accommodate that technology.
I seem to recall a year ago the need for a study to be complete so that the federal government could release some funds. I don't know if it's for this initiative or if it's for the initiative for moving to electric buses.
So
I think that's right.
Yes, you're close there. So this is sort of the precursor to that study. This is a study saying, is it feasible for us to make a transition?
I see.
And then there'll be a second piece of it that is a transition plan that says, we are transitioning, this is how we intend to do it. That piece is what the federal government requires, and they're able to give us funding once we have that piece in place, saying how we're going to make that transition happen.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I don't know if you're going to get to this later, and if so, just say, okay, I'm going to get there.
Okay.
But one of the questions I've had is whether it would be more possible to do electric vehicles if we decided we were going to have smaller buses rather than the big behemoths. And if so, number one, that would solve a problem of and the people wouldn't necessarily need a CDL or the same CDL rating. Number two, it might well be able to get around the city for the entire day. And if we're going to be substantially increasing the number of times buses are running, presumably the capacity of each individual bus would be less important than it might be right now.
It's dependent on route, for sure, because we do have some routes that do need that full capacity. But I think in terms of changing the vehicle sizes and changing how we are basically structuring the service, that may be a better discussion for the transit strategic plan that CAT will have to kick off here in the next month or so. They will be doing that plan through the end of the year, and that's a state requirement for us. So we'll have to sit down and think about how we want to structure that service going forward.
I mean, I'm just concerned that if we're coming to a conclusion that electric vehicles are not workable because of certain assumptions about the size of the vehicle and so on, and it turns out that if we go to a different size vehicle, maybe they do make it through the day without a problem. Well, those two issues ought to connect at some point.
Actually, we are using a consultant for this that did the exact same study for John. And John was looking at the smaller size vehicles and running into the same range issues as what we're looking at for the larger vehicles. It's just,
Interesting.
So this, I don't know if this is basically the same thing that Councilor Pigston asked, but basically, are you waiting until the conclusion of this study before you determine if and how seriously you would pursue programs in the recent federal legislation, like the bipartisan infrastructure law and the one before it that include a lot of money for municipal electrification?
Right. So we would have to have that zero emissions transition plan in place in order to access those federal funds. This gets us to the point of should we transition or not, and what fuel should we transition to. Then there'll be a follow-on piece that our consultant will complete that says this is what the transition looks like, and then we would be able to program out exactly how we're going after those funds.
I guess maybe I'm just not understanding it, but to me it's kind of like a chicken and egg thing where the cost-benefit analysis looks a lot different if it's federal funded versus like all locally.
Right, and we're not doing a pure cost-benefit analysis. We are showing what benefits are, and we are showing what the costs are, but we're not mixing them together and saying you're getting, this cost-benefit ratio or anything.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, are you finished?
Yes.
Just have a quick follow came up with a transit expansion or a big expansion, the pool of money statewide didn't necessarily expand. And so, like if Richmond or Harrisonburg did something big, then that could potentially take money away from other localities. So I don't know if things have changed so that if someone beats us to the punch, maybe it'd be less money for us or vice versa, you know. I think the pot should be bigger, but I just want to know.
Right now, from my understanding of the state funding situation, is the pot is bigger right now. In terms of, you know, if one agency does better, then another agency might not. That seems to be more relevant on the operating side. There's an operating formula that looks at individual agency performance and sort of balances it out statewide. Not really the case for major capital investments. Goes through a somewhat different formula process that is not so directly competitive agency to agency.
Thank you, sir.
All right, we can move on to another mode. Next slide. So we're going to talk about the Dockless Mobility Permit Program, also known as our scooters. These regulations were originally adopted in 2019 after a pilot program was held. VEO has been one of our vendors since 2020, so since the beginning of this permanent program. We've had 2 other vendors hold the permit at one point. They no longer do. VEO is the only permit holder. And that permit is typically managed by our bike ped coordinator. We have not had a bike coordinator for quite some time. So when I was brought on in November, VEO approached the city and said, hey, we haven't had anybody to talk to about this for a while, but we'd like to revisit the permit regulations. We know that there are some concerns on your side of the table, and there's some concerns on our side of the table, so let's hash this out and see if we can make this relationship work a little bit better for both of us. Next slide, please. So it's working actually pretty well. These are from, actually, I downloaded these today. The top is sort of monthly rides all last year. So you'll see, you know, when it's warm in the spring, April, we do pretty well. We have over 30,000 rides a month. And then in the fall, we had our best fall ever. We had huge numbers in September, October, and November compared to the previous year. In total last year, we had about 250,000 rides on our scooters. As you can see from the start and end locations, a lot of them are being used on the UVA side of West Main, and they are coming to the downtown mall a lot. You also see some traffic out near Barracks Road, but it's typically looking a lot like this is a mode very important to UVA students. So we can go to the next slide. So here are the issues that were on both sides of the table. So VEO's biggest issue as a private company is, unsurprisingly, revenue. In our market, they pay us in fees about 12% of what they take in revenue. In almost any other market, it's 4 or 5%. So we're triple everybody else, basically.
How did we end up there, do you know? I know you weren't here. But
I have no clue how we ended up
Okay.
there, but it seems like it was, you know, something from the original permitting regulations that, you know, VEO didn't have a ton of experience with it. We didn't have a ton of experience with it. The other
somebody
vendors that
picked
we had,
12% and everybody went with it?
yeah, pretty much. But it's been difficult for them to maintain revenues that way. The other issue that they brought to the table was the flexibility of their fleet. We have built into our regulations some very sort of Byzantine triggers of, if you do this, you can get this many extra scooters on the street, and if you do this, you can get this many more extra scooters on the street. And they said, you know, instead of having to have this back and forth with the city on how many scooters we can have on the street and doing all of this math of, you know, we did X and so now we get Y, can we just, you know, control our own fleet and put out scooters and e-bikes the way that we need to in order to serve our customers? This is also, it's on the VEO side of the table, but it's also a concern for city staff because we also have to be the ones managing all of these Byzantine rules for how the scooters are managed as well. So on the city side, these are things you'll be very familiar with. Parking is the number one concern that we hear across the board. Mostly parking on sidewalks, parking in front of businesses, parking on curb ramps, basically blocking sidewalks and bike lanes. That's the biggest concern. Second is safety. We've had a lot of reports of unsafe operations in streets, people weaving in and out of traffic, operating in places where we don't think they're supposed to be operating. Equity is also a concern. It's not the cheapest mode of transportation. I'd say a trip basically costs $4 at minimum. When you take into account the initial unlock fee, the per minute fee, it adds up pretty quickly. So it's kind of a difficult mode for us to promote to low-income populations. And lastly, outreach. We haven't been promoting this very much, especially in the past 3 years as this program has existed. As I mentioned at the beginning, we've had issues historically with transportation planning outreach, and this is no different. So
while we're here on this page, what have we been receiving in terms of absolute numbers and fees?
Last year, I believe it was about $120,000.
Was the fee issue, the 12% issue, why, or to contribute to why the other companies decided to bail on us?
One of the companies we asked not to come back, and the other one I'm not sure, but I imagine it would have something to do with profitability.
Okay. Thanks.
And I'll get into details about how we're addressing each of these in some slides coming up. Actually, you can go to the next slide, and this sort of will give you an overview of the changes that we're looking at. So for the high fees, we're looking at reducing the per ride fee. I believe it's 25 cents right now. We would reduce that to 20 cents and remove the per vehicle fee. For fleet flexibility, we would just change from having little tiny rules of what we can do with X and Y to just having a higher cap. For parking, we're looking at piloting parking hubs along West Main to start, and also implementing parking fees for misplaced vehicles. For safety, we'd be implementing an education mode on the first ride, and I'll have more details on that because you don't really know what education mode is. Equity, we're looking at a reduced price access program, and for outreach, we're looking at VEO providing 2 outreach events per quarter, specifically to low-income populations and to college populations.
So there is a way for the system to know if it's parked where it shouldn't be and to dock the dockless person?
When you finish your trip on a VEO scooter right now, when you park, you have to take a picture.
Oh.
And you send it into VEO.
Interesting.
Right now, they don't do anything with that.
Huh.
Other than check the picture if they get a complaint and go out and move the vehicle. In the future, that would change. And
Interesting.
Include
Okay.
fees. Yeah.
So with the fee getting reduced, is that passed down to the consumers and the users, or is that just increased profits for...
Increased profits for VEO.
Yeah. I guess I just have a little bit of question about kind of trust but verify in terms of their claims about the fees.
Right. Yeah, that's fair. All right, and I can jump into more detail on all of these, including that one is the first up. So if we can go to the next slide. As I mentioned, we are at about 12% of revenues with our fees. Most other markets are at 4 to 5. The other issue is that we charge that fee on the first of the year when we issue that permit. That locks them in to how many vehicles they have on the street. If they want to come back and say, well, we're willing to do these other things now, can we put more on the street? We have to go through, we wouldn't charge them another fee, and it starts to become more onerous. So reducing the per ride fee, removing the per vehicle fee, it does benefit them more. It does give them more profit, but it does help us a little bit as well. Second, changing the higher max cap to no bonuses. Currently, we have a cap of 350 scooters written into the regulation. It's specifically scooters. There is no cap for e-bikes built into the regulation. And in fact, some of the bonuses for providing more scooters on top of that cap include add e-bikes to the fleet. So if you say we're going to add 25 e-bikes to the roads, you also get 25 scooters to add to that 350 cap. So we're going back and forth with VAO and saying, all right, well, if you do X, you can have more Y. And they really just want to be able to say, hey, it's a sunny day out. Let's throw a bunch of scooters out on the road because they're going to get used today. Or, hey, the weather's not great. It's December. Let's take all vehicles off the road that aren't being used so that we don't have a bunch of vehicles poorly parked all over the place. So they would like the flexibility to be able to do that without having to check with us all the time. This would also help fix that loophole with the e-bikes. So if we moved it to just, you can have 700 vehicles at most on our streets, but we don't care if they're e-bikes, we don't care if they're scooters. You guys figure out the right mix for it and then tell us what you're doing. And
Is there a reason why we should care?
not that I can discern.
I mean, I was wondering if there's some reason why we need to be trying to give incentives to have more e-bikes or incentives or the other way around. I don't know.
I think originally the idea was we did want to incentivize there being more e-bikes on the road, that we didn't want to just get stuck with scooters. But at this point, they're putting e-bikes on the road and finding that they're just as popular with their users as the scooters. So they're interested in putting more.
All right. Thanks.
All right. We can move on to the next slide. All right. So for parking, we're looking at implementing parking hubs along West Main Street. Currently, we have an issue with scooters kind of being all over the place, especially on West Main Street. On UVA grounds, they have implemented this hub system already and have found it very useful. The one issue that they are running into on UVA is they also have a lot of privately owned personal scooters that are not parking in the correct places, and VAO is getting the finger pointed at them of, hey, these scooters are parked all over the place, and it's actually not their scooters. So we're looking at implementing something similar along West Main Street. We'll be implementing these at specific large bike racks, basically. We've identified about a half a dozen locations along the West Main corridor where we can put these areas where we will want people to go park if they're close. If they're not close, they can still park like they do as long as they don't block the sidewalk or an entrance to a business. But if they're close to one of these hubs, we want them to sort of everybody to get to that hub. It'll make finding a scooter easier for people. It'll make parking a scooter easier for people. It's a lot more straightforward than just do with what you will, as we have right now.
So I'm sorry, I have a couple of quick questions. Do you know right now if on some days there just is no bikes or scooters available? I mean, I know it might be one or two here and there, but for the most part, some days most of the scooters and e-bikes are in use?
I would say that there are always scooters and bikes available. I would also say that there are some days that not every scooter is being used every day.
They wish. So I'm trying to figure out how do they know they want more? Is it
mostly from data trends of, hey, it's going to be September and 75 degrees
That
out
type
for
of
a
thing.
week.
Just-
We want to have as many vehicles out there as we
Yeah.
can. Yeah.
Another quick question. For the education that they get, I don't know when you sign up for it, you have to probably get an app, and so I don't, as part of the education, I think if they just did a 2 or 3 minute video or something that says that, if you leave it on the sidewalk, just think about people in a wheelchair or whatever, that something that sparks it. I know these kids are smart. They wouldn't do it at home, but they just feel like they're away and they just leave them anywhere. And anyway, I just think it's more that potentially could be done on the education side.
And we're actually going to get to that next, but
Okay.
the app currently does have some instructions when you sign up that do tell you how you're supposed to ride, that you should wear a helmet, that you should not park in front of businesses in the middle of sidewalks. Clearly, that's not enough.
Yeah.
And so I'll get to the education mode in just a
I'm
second.
sorry.
But I'll finish with the parking. The other issue, aside from piloting hubs, VAO is looking at including parking fees for misplaced vehicles. They can do this through their user agreement. They would be collecting the fees themselves. They've done this in some other locations, and it's helped with the parking. It hasn't resulted in tons of tickets being generated, but typically they've been getting a reaction from the first offense is just a warning, second offense is a very low fee, and basically once you get to that second offense, most of the bad behavior drops off, or they stop using the vehicle. So they will start enforcing that once the permit goes into effect, once the new permit goes into effect. All right, so education mode. This is actually one of my favorite things that they're looking to do. So they looked at data from the CDC and from Austin, Texas, who were looking at their scooter programs. And Austin was really concerned about safety and crashes that they were having with University of Texas students mostly. So they looked at the data and they saw, well, there's a big spike for first-time users in number of crashes, and then it peters off after that. So we really need to deal with the first-time users who are getting on the thing and just opening up the throttle and let's go. So what they introduced is something they call education mode. It cuts down the speed to 8 miles per hour. Right now the top speed is 15. It cuts it down to 8 miles an hour, so you can't hop on and just take off. And it includes additional instructions for riding and parking and how you're supposed to, on top of what they already have. And additionally, VAO is going to be adding a rider safety quiz for new users, which they've been piloting in some other markets. One of those markets was the Bronx in New York City. Overall, they found that they were having fairly low crash rates when they had the education mode implemented. And then they looked at that graph of who was having the crashes, and it was similar rates of crashes for new users and experienced users once they had that education mode in place. So just putting a throttle on it and reining people in a little bit has resulted in a lot of safety benefits for them. Even after having the education mode, the riders that they surveyed still said they were a little unsure about where they were supposed to ride and where they were supposed to park, which means the education mode isn't a silver bullet. It helps a lot with safety. It may not help us address the parking concerns that we have, which we're trying to tackle with some other tools in our toolkit. But we are going to have to continue to do outreach to make sure that people understand where to ride, where to park, how to do it safely. We can go to the next one. All right, so for equity, the VAO is looking to implement a reduced price access program. They call it VAO Access, and it is basically a subscription service for anyone on any low-income residents. They use different state and federal assistance programs. They're also willing to look at local assistance programs to determine who is qualified for this. But for $5 a month with VAO Access, you get no unlock fees. So anytime you get on a VAO scooter or you bike right now, it costs $1 to unlock it. That would be waived for anyone in this program. You get one ride free every day for up to 30 minutes. And then any other rides that you get during that day beyond that first ride would be at a discounted per minute rate. So this makes it a lot more affordable for all of our residents to use the scooters. I'm not sure what sort of uptake we'll get in our community, but I know that in Seattle, they've had 40% of their rides are through this program now, as of last month. They just started doing it in May last year, so it's caught on very quickly. New York City has a similar program. It's only about 11% of rides, but that's still a fairly significant chunk, especially in a city that has such robust public transportation like New York does. So, somewhere between 10 and 40% of our rides being done by people who are low-income residents getting to work or getting to school is laudable. I think that's something that we can definitely be excited about. And then lastly, VEO is going to be conducting more outreach, 2 outreach events per quarter, so 8 times a year they're going to be out promoting their services, promoting VEO access, promoting better parking, better safety. They have already been in contact with our Bike Ped Advisory Committee about supporting them through Bike to Work Day, and sort of expanding that definition of Bike to Work Day to include e-bikes and scooters, so that it's more of a low speed to work day. So the next steps for this, and we can go on to the next slide. Any feedback that y'all have on how we're going to address the regulations, as well as feedback that we've collected from BPAC, would be incorporated into the revised regulations. We'd be bringing that to you by the end of the month for adoption. That would also come with an extension of VEO's current permit so that they can apply for the new permit. That permit would go through the end of the year, and then we'd open up a full year permit in December for VEO to apply for next year. I will note, when I'm saying VEO is going to apply and VEO is going to do this, it could also be other vendors. This is opened up to, Lime and Bird and all of the other vendors that do this would have the capability of jumping in on our market, and based on the reduced fees, they may be more interested. So that's where we are on the dockless permit program.
Okay.
Any questions on that one?
I just would say that all this is very good information, that one of the more important things to me is the education. We get a lot of comments about them being left where they shouldn't. So as they're coming up with ways to, even if it's part of the education mode or the initial, not the education mode, when they're signing up for the app, if something can be included about this, the importance of that, because it could have and I know that it's a form of transportation, not just for students. I see a lot of people using it for entertainment, for transportation to work, not entertainment, just for recreation, I meant to say. But I think that just where they're left is really, could be life-threatening to some people who may have to go off a curve or something like that. So anyway,
Absolutely.
This is very good. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I can definitely relay that feedback to VEO. They've been really easy to work with and would be happy to add more data about education to their app.
One thought that I had was whether on the access program for low-income people, if you're going to have one 30-minute ride a day, if somebody wanted to take it to and from work, it might be preferable to have 2 15-minute rides a day than one 30-minute ride. If you've gotten a 30-minute ride to work, what are you going to do, walk home? That's a long walk.
Right. Yeah.
So, anyway.
Okay. Yeah, I can bring that to VEO's attention as well. I'm sure there's a reason for the splitting it that way, but I couldn't tell you why.
Mr. Rogers?
Ben, who will we call when there's a scooter in the road? Is there a local?
Yes.
What's the local operation here?
So every scooter has printed on it a customer service number and an email address to VEO, and underneath that it has the vehicle number. If we supply that to VEO, they can have that scooter moved. They said typically they move scooters within 2 hours. They have local staff who does operations that does the rotating scooters and bikes around town, and they can be pretty quick at responding to something like that.
Okay. And I guess it's something that we should publicize that more, too.
Yes.
Because if a citizen comes across a scooter that's an annoyance in their way, they ought to know where they can look to get the number to call to have somebody move it.
Yeah, absolutely. And that should also be part of our outreach
Yeah.
as we're talking to residents.
We also have misplaced scooters as an option in the 311 system, and those are routed directly to.
Okay, that's good.
I didn't even know that.
Mr. Chambers, is there a possibility when we're talking about education and the various things that you mentioned in your slide regarding education and outreach for the scooters or e-bikes, that there could be some type of incentive for putting them in the docking stations? Like you have your $5 fee to encourage low-income people. You have the 30-minute free ride. So for, I don't know, every 5 times that you dock your e-bike or your scooter in the right place, you might get a reduction on the next ride or points, however you develop that. But whenever you have incentives, young people seem to be incentivized by incentives.
Yeah, sure.
And so maybe that might be one thing you can talk to your vendor about, or maybe that may be something that other vendors, when you do your RFP, will be able to discuss and have in their proposals.
Yeah, and Veo does do that in some markets instead of just doing the fee-based parking fees. Mm-hmm. They do have incentive for parking at the hubs built into some of their markets. Mm-hmm. We haven't, put that on paper as something that we absolutely need here, but that is something we can talk about what that looks like with Veo.
Okay, I guess
On that, is it true that if you're close to a hub, you can't end your ride if you don't park in a hub?
It will direct. Yes. Yes, you would be directed to park at a hub. If you didn't park at the hub, it would treat it as if it was a misplaced vehicle, and you would get that. They would look at the picture that was sent in and see, yeah, this person didn't even make an effort to get to a hub. Let's, slap them on the wrist. Yeah.
I guess I'm still not understanding what is it that we're gaining by reducing their fee.
Well, we're gaining possible competition for them that may serve us better. We're also gaining that we won't have to actively manage them as closely because we're not, keeping track of how many vehicles that they're putting on the street on a daily basis. Mm-hmm. That's the biggest benefit.
So in other words, there's less just kind of like staff capacity needed to monitor the fee, and we're not really, at the end of the day, generating that much revenue from it.
Exactly.
Yeah. I guess I can understand that. I guess I'm still just wonder whether before they're kind of rewarded financially in that way, just seeing a little bit more proof they're actually going to follow through on some of these great new things they say they're going to do. Because we've heard a lot about how they'll pick up the scooters and improve it, but at least anecdotally, it hasn't really improved.
Right. And by writing these things into the permit regulations, we won't just have to wait and see if they're doing it. They will have to do it. So we would build into our regulations that they do have to provide an access program, that they do have to provide parking hubs as directed by the bike ped coordinator. There would be things that they have to do, and it wouldn't just be, are they going to do everything they promised? Mm-hmm. So.
And then it would be the bike ped coordinator's job to make sure that those things are enforced.
Right, and that is supposed to be their job currently, actually, is enforcing the current regulations. They haven't been, frankly.
Okay. So what are the chances that I get to the bike hub and there are no places for my bike because it's full? Then what do I do?
Well, so their hubs will not be docks.
Oh.
It'll be basically like paint on the ground saying, park it here.
Okay.
So there should be space. If there's not space, there should be some real close.
But real close, but I'm not at the hub. Am I going to get a fee?
Probably not.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay.
All
You
right.
just have to think about all contingencies.
Mm-hmm. You want to move on to the next one?
Okay.
I lost my slides.
Uh-oh.
So the next thing we're going to talk about is a regional plan. It's the Safe Streets and Roads for All Action Plan. This is something that came out of the bipartisan infrastructure law. It established the Safe Streets and Roads for All program with about $5 billion for the next 5 years. So Secretary Pete has some money to hand out, but in order to access that money, we have to have an action plan saying, this is how we intend to spend the money, this is how we intend to improve things. So we partnered with TJPDC. We thought this was a better idea to do as a region than just as a city. And they helped us coordinate with the surrounding localities to put together a proposal for this grant that came up for action planning. We won the grant last month with TJPDC. We were awarded over $800,000 to complete this action plan. It's the second highest amount that was given out in the Commonwealth, and part of that is because we did that coordination as a region. A lot of the other areas are doing it as individual localities, and we partnered with the region, and so we got a big chunk of money. We can go to the next slide. So the result of this action plan is going to be basically different chapters of this plan will address safety concerns and recommendations in each locality that's involved. So all the localities in Region 10 are involved. They'll each have their own chapter. When we were scoping this out with the consultant that was helping us put together the grant application, we wanted more outreach and engagement included in our chapter, partly because we have more modes to deal with than some of our partners. We have a lot more bike, we have a lot more pedestrian, we have a lot more transit. We have cars that we need to deal with for sure, but we have a lot more variety going on in the city. So we wanted more outreach engagement to make sure that we were covering all the bases. We're currently enrolled in a local infrastructure hub boot camp. That's a nonprofit that works with jurisdictions across the country to make sure that they have the education on planning resources. We're in a boot camp for the implementation grant, so what comes after the action grant. Once we have that action plan grant completed and we have the action plan chapter sitting in front of us, then we can go to the federal government and say, we need grants for implementation now. Here's what our action plan is. So we're going to spend the next 12 months, I believe, once we get this completely scoped out, identifying the safety needs and funding availability for projects in our area and specifically in our city, and that's going to inform our near-term priorities as we go after federal funding. That's all of the detail we have on this project right now, but just wanted to bring it to your attention that we are going to be doing a lot more engagement on safety in the region, and it's going to be associated with this project coming up. And I'll move on to our last bit.
Quick question. So assuming all this works out and we get some grants, what sort of projects might we see? Would this be like more sidewalks or more, what might be a typical project if you were to...
Yeah, it could be sidewalks. It could be bike facilities. It could be roadway projects. It could be a highway project. It could be a lot of things.
Okay.
Just in general, aimed at improving safety, though.
Cool.
Yeah. So I mentioned our near-term priorities on the last slide, and the last thing I want to talk about is how we are prioritizing bike and pedestrian projects in the city. So right now we have a comprehensive plan that identifies several documents as making up what we call the Transportation Master Plan in the city. That includes the Bike Ped Master Plan from 2015. That includes the Streets That Work Plan, the ADA Transition Plan, CATS Transit Development Plan from 2018, and a variety of small area plans that have been completed in the past decade. The priorities and recommendations in these documents don't align with each other. All of these plans are fairly old and are using pre-pandemic data, stakeholder input, and travel patterns that we haven't seen in quite a few years. The priorities in these plans also don't account for staffing challenges. They're very optimistic about what it thinks the city can accomplish. I think if you look back at 2015 Bike Ped Master Plan or the 2016 Streets That Work Plan, it said that we were going to do a lot of stuff that we didn't get done. So we need to look at all of these plans and say, okay, what are our priorities now based on the data that we have now and what we know about transportation and specifically bike ped transportation in the city. What do we need to change about what our priorities are? So if you can go to the next slide. We identified that we needed to do this prioritization to clarify some things. So we worked with the Office of Intermodal Planning and Investment. That's under the Secretary of Transportation's office in state government to get a grant that would help us reassess what our priorities were using both quantitative metrics with updated data as well as some qualitative inputs. The quantitative, well, actually all of this analysis has been done for projects that were identified in the Bike Ped Master Plan and in the Streets That Work Plan. We're done with the quantitative stage of this project, and now we're in this internal vetting qualitative portion of it. So if we go to the next slide, it's a very fun diagram. Starting on the left, we have the input, which is the Bike Ped Master Plan and Streets That Work projects go into this quantitative assessment. The quantitative assessment is looking at 4 different factors. It's looking at suitability, so what's the bike score or the walk score? How close is it to a school? How close is it to transit? What's the topography look like in this area? Secondly, demand. We're looking at loads data, which looks at travel demand between different zones within the city. And we're also looking at streetlight data, which is a proprietary data source that looks at where is actual travel happening on our roads today. Third, we look at connectivity. So that's just sort of looking at the network and seeing how long are these segments that we're trying to work on. Do they connect to different parts of the network? Are they adding in more connections? And lastly, we look at safety. That includes areas where there's lots of crashes as well as areas where there's lots of travel on a daily basis. All of those are pulled together in our quantitative assessment, and it spits out a list of, quantitatively, these are your sidewalk projects you should look at, and these are your bike facility projects you should look at. We know looking at that list that there are some projects on there that don't make sense. So we put them through a qualitative assessment as well. And that looks at another 4 factors, starting with equity. So are we distributing these projects evenly across the community? Are they concentrated in one place? Are we making sure that we're serving populations who actually need bike and pedestrian facilities? We look at feasibility. Do we have money to do these projects? Can they physically actually be done? And do we have the staffing to do them within the next 3 to 5 years? Paving schedule is another element of feasibility, but it's slightly separate. We want to make sure that we're aligning these projects with when public service is planning to go out and repave streets so that we're not tearing up the streets multiple times to put in new projects. And then lastly, we're looking at feedback from stakeholders, including showing the priorities to y'all, neighborhood leaders, stakeholder groups, and making sure everybody is okay with what priorities we're listing. We're also looking at synergies between different projects. So if there's 2 projects that are listed and they're right next to each other, we don't want to treat them as 2 different projects. We want to combine them as one project that we'll be pursuing at the same time. This sort of vets out our list. This is where we are right now. That's what that red star is supposed to be showing you, is we are here. At the end of looking through the qualitative assessment, we'll have priorities for sidewalks and bike facilities. You'll notice that there is a little arrow coming off the side that says SHAROs. We are going, right now, the way that the lists look, a lot of our bike priorities that are coming out of the quantitative assessment are SHAROs. And if you don't know what a SHARO is, it's basically the painting on the ground in the middle of a lane that is an arrow and has a little picture of a guy on a bike that says bikes are going to be here. It's not a protected bike lane. It's not even a bike lane. It's a bike is going to be in the middle of the road with you. Pay attention. We're splitting those out separately as not projects in our prioritized list because we kind of just wanted those to be automatic. If public service is going out and repaving and we've already said there should be a Sharrow on that spot, they're just going to go ahead and put a Sharrow on that spot. We don't need to pretend that that's a project. We don't need a project manager for that. We just need somebody to lay down a layer of paint one time. So we're going to pull those out and not say that those are actually helping us meet our goals for the city. Those are just going to happen.
So good to add a new word to my vocabulary.
Good, good. If we can go to the next slide, and I'll tell you what the next steps are. So the next steps, the first one is remove the Sharrows from the list. Before we even start talking about internal vetting and what the feasibility is of these projects, we're going to take those out of the bike facilities list. Then we're going to conduct our internal review, identify potential synergies between projects, and sort of come up with a draft list of what these priorities are that we can take to stakeholders for feedback on those. Then we'll revise that list of priorities and bring them to you for your adoption. We would be revisiting this list annually to make sure that things have changed. If there are better projects that we could be tackling based on available funding, we can move things around annually that way, but generally stay with the exact same list that we have, just maybe sort the order a little bit different. And then lastly, we're going to be documenting our lessons learned through this prioritization process. We know, as I mentioned at the beginning, something that you have to do, one indicator of good planning is that it's continuous. We're going to be prioritizing projects again in the future. We're going to have to talk about transportation master planning again in the future, and we're going to continue to have to do that. So we're going to have to learn from this process to make sure that we're doing a better job of it in the future. And with that, I have no more slides. So if you have any questions on that process or on anything else I've provided, I'm good to go.
Yeah, it was a great presentation. Thank you. Could you go back to that last slide? So has council seen a list before? Okay, so this is new?
I don't think council has seen a list of
Okay.
prioritized projects since probably Streets That Work.
Okay. Yeah, I know that.
It's all of us.
Yeah.
I know that there are many, many people listening or watching who will be really excited about that because I think many people feel like it's just a mystery. And so having a list and having priorities, even if a person may not like precisely the way the priorities laid out, knowing that it's there and that it's being thought about will make a huge difference.
Yeah. Previously, our priorities were basically we had so many plans that everything was a priority.
Yeah, which means you don't have priorities.
Exactly. So the priority became whatever we had funding for.
Yeah.
And we could point to whichever plan we wanted to, and that wasn't a priority.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I get most frequently when I'm meeting with neighborhood groups, they always have some pet project, some pet sidewalk that they've been wanting to have built for 10 years, and they ask me, why haven't you built my sidewalk yet? And of course my answer is, that doesn't come before me. I don't really know. I'm sorry, I can't help you. How are decisions made on what sidewalks to build in what order?
That's a good question.
Either substantively or procedurally. I'd like to be able to tell people either one.
Well, the answer is going to become this process.
Okay.
What it was previous to this process is a question mark, honestly.
All right. And when do you think that when do you think you will have an answer to this question that people are asking me?
I would say probably by the summer.
Oh, great.
Yeah.
Okay.
We'll be rolling out, stakeholder engagement probably in May, June.
Okay.
On the draft lists, and then in the summer we would be coming before you to adopt the final list.
Now, one of the other questions that has arisen in recent years is whether we have the ability to actually build these sidewalks, and whether it's a matter of having people in public works who do sidewalk stuff, or whether it's having contracts with outside vendors who might do it. One of the things we've fallen afoul of is the lack of project managers to make sure that the thing actually gets from idea to street. Are we in better shape now?
We will be with this process because we are building into that qualitative assessment that feasibility of can we do it in the next 3 to 5 years, and that discussion will be considerate of staffing levels and you know, how have we performed in the past few years with the staffing levels that we've had, what kinds of projects were we able to get done in the past few years, and what does that look like going forward.
Has our priority list, the sidewalk priorities list, ever been made public? Is that something that's kept in-house? Or
The Bike Ped Master Plan has a prioritized list that has been publicly available.
But I mean, is that the list that City Hall is actually implementing?
That's the list that I would say not 100% consistently, but yes, that's the plan that we point to when we discuss which
in any
sidewalks.
event, when this process is over, there will be a list that is available that somebody could look at and hopefully post it online or someplace where we say, okay, the next one up is this one, and here are the 3 projects that are next up. Boom, boom, boom.
Yeah, I don't know if I would say, we're putting them in specific order because we don't want to, get ourselves in a bind if a funding source comes up, but we do want to say this is the list of what we want to get done in the next 3 years or 3 to 5 years.
One of my great hopes, and I've mentioned this a couple different times in different ways, is that both for City Council's benefit and for the general public's benefit, that there would be a list of all capital projects that are lined up to go in the next 5, 10, however many years we've got, even if it's simply to say this one is going to be built in 2027. But to be able to say, because what often happens for council is we approve something in the capital improvement plan, and it's sort of a fire and forget thing. Okay, we've made our decision, and we have no idea what's actually getting implemented.
Right.
And then I look, and one of my favorite things to complain about is the authorized but not issued list of bonds, where we have things going back 5 years where we authorize a project to be done and it hasn't been done, and all the council ever knows is, well, we approved that. Didn't it just happen? And I get very frustrated that I can't answer people's questions. I can't answer my own questions.
Yeah, and projects are at different stages. Some of them haven't started yet and have been sitting to wait to be started for a while.
And so put that on the list. This isn't due until 2027.
Right, and these would be projects that don't have, the ones that we're prioritizing are ones that don't have a funding program to them yet. So they wouldn't even be included with those projects that we've forgotten about. But for the ones that are existing and upcoming that we've already programmed funds for, we are trying to pull together internally, sort of figure out what the status of those projects are so that we can put together something that we can share with council so they are more aware of what's going on with projects.
I mean, one of my goals here is for people to be able to know that city government is actually doing things.
Yeah.
And if we're not telling people, they don't know.
Right.
Okay.
So are you saying that the list of priorities will be done based on funding that you currently have? Or will your list of priorities also include your stakeholders and things that they feel may be important? And if funds can be adjusted within what you already have, those things will happen? Or
Right.
are you saying both?
It's a little bit of both, but it's more. So when we're looking at the feasibility of projects that we're evaluating, funding wouldn't be one of our biggest criteria. It would be more or less, are we asking for a ridiculous amount of money or not? That kind of question. But more so, the priorities will be driven by stakeholder input, by our professional opinions on whether something can be constructed or not, our paving schedule, and less so to do with the available funding, because we don't know what all of the available funding for these projects would necessarily be at this point.
And how do you receive stakeholder input?
We will be going to neighborhood groups to talk with them.
So you'll be going to the various neighborhood associations and presenting to them?
Mhm.
Okay.
So, are you finished? Ms.
I'm
Purdy?
done.
Okay. I think one of the ways we can get updates, and I mentioned this back in the fall, but we're waiting for your arrival, is to get quarterly updates. The board, just similar to what you're doing now, may not have to be this comprehensive, but just to come and give us a heads up what's, major projects and things. When I was doing planning, it was a long time ago, but people would call in either to a board supervisor member or staff and say, I want this road paved or I want this road widened, and I would just collect them. And at one time a year when we were, when we would go through the process, we had a priority process that we would go through. And I know city funding for transportation goes through a different process, but has to be a way throughout the year you can collect this information and see if it meets the criteria type of thing. So,
Yeah.
but I would like to say that I would like a quarterly update for transportation projects, and I don't know if that's something we have to give you the heads up as council. If you all support that, then if quarterly.
Something we ought to talk with the city manager's office
Okay.
about. I've been agitating for some sort of an update on our capital projects for some time, and maybe we can get that not just for transportation, but for everything.
Yeah.
All CIP. Yeah.
No.
Yeah, and I'll just say that in my conversations with Mr. Sanders and with Mr. Freeze and with you, I think we all would recognize that this is a huge amount of work to get where you are tonight. To be able to sort of look at the past and say, okay, these things didn't work, and we're going to figure out a way to go forward as a government. And so I just want to thank you for that. I know it's been a lot of work. I do think if we are able to get, semi-frequent updates, that would be great. And I know the very first slide or first or second slide, you had all the different areas, and tonight you only presented on 4 when it took you over an hour to do that.
Yeah.
Hopefully those other ones will get a chance to get an update as
Absolutely.
well. So this really is the kind of topic where we get so much feedback from our constituents, understandably. And so this,
And
Thanks.
I suppose we should not let you go without passing on comment from someone everybody else on council will recognize, having gotten many comments from her before about the scooters. It says, these people do not follow safety. They do not respond within 2 hours to remove. Talked about one time there were 6 scooters that were in the way, and finally were removed on the 5th day of accumulation. So I think that there certainly have been a number of lapses, and we need to figure out some way to make sure that we minimize those and respond to them in some better way, because I know this person, and she's a good person, and it's not a crank, and she is clearly concerned about this topic, and I want to be responsive to what she is reporting as fact.
Yeah.
And there continue to be problems.
Yeah,
So,
obviously.
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chambers.
All right, well, thank you so much.
Let me second Mr. Pinkston's comments about it. They appreciate all the work that's been involved. Thank you. Mr. City Manager, anything else we need to take up right now?
Not at this point.
All right, so shall we do a closed circuit, closed session, closed circuit, whatever.
that as well, I guess.
We just got the text by
sure.
email.
I've got a copy here.
Okay.
Pursuant to Section 2.2-3712 of the Virginia Code, I hereby move that City Council close this open meeting and convene in a closed session as authorized by Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A1 to discuss the following appointments. 1, to the Charlottesville Affordable Housing Fund Committee, and 2, to certain boards and committee seats. And Virginia Code Section 2.2-3711A8 for consultation with legal counsel retained by counsel specifically regarding the city's collective bargaining negotiation process and subsequent agreements.
Is there a second?
Second.
Okay, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? Okay, motion carries 5-0. We will now go into closed session. We will return about 6:30 with the rest of the agenda at that point. See y'all later.